you about how 2020 unfolded, or was the most consequential thing about how 2020 unfolded? Is that something that you think you could talk about in 2 minutes?
I mean, take your pick, right? Like, everything about this year has been unprecedented, but, you know, I think what frustrates me the most about kind of how the election unfolded from a practitioner standpoint of how it went was the fact that we knew this was going to happen to some extent in terms of voter irregularities, right? We've never done this before, okay? We've never voted by mail in this many numbers. We knew this was coming. And some people in DC were screaming about it for a long time. Look, do something, get people on the ground, get your teams in place, work with the states. I wish we had leveraged the big omnibus spending bill that just passed, you know, the House and Senate to force states to address these voter irregularities. We knew this was coming and we didn't really address it. And I think that's one of my biggest frustrations kind of in the short term. You know, but I think obviously no one saw COVID coming, and I think, you know, there's no way you can prepare for a black swan of that magnitude, but we have a lot of political professionals in DC whose job is to respond quickly, and we failed at that. And unfortunately, you know, the momentum to fix this going forward is now in flux. We don't know if it's going to happen, and I think this needs to be a real focus for us going forward if we're going to win elections ever again.
So, Matt, you know, you hear this, it's controversial to even suggest that there was consequential amounts of voter fraud that may have changed the results of the election, right? So what was the nature of what happened? And do you think it was enough to make a difference in a number of states?
So when I first started trying to look into this problem after Election Day, I was completely open-minded, and that's well documented. I didn't know what I would find. In fact, I really hoped that I wouldn't find evidence of substantial, potentially illegal ballots. That was my hope, because I know that there are three big problems with voter fraud. Number one is the fraud itself, because our conclusion was that there was enough of it in enough states that it was determinative in the election, such that we don't know for certain who was the deserved winner. The number of illegal ballots we determined in enough states were such that it surpassed the margin of victory, which means we do not know who is the deserved winner. I use that word because it came from the New York Times when they were writing about this exact same issue in 2012. They said the problem with mail-in ballots is it's easily frauded. It's been frauded many times before, and it's going to happen again. There will be many cases where we won't know who the deserved winner is. So I entered into this hoping that I wouldn't find that problem, because, as I said, there are three problems with voter fraud. Number one is that it occurs. Number two is that, as you know, a movement on the right, as conservatives, there were a lot of things that impacted this election. You said, well, 2012, you know, who could have seen this coming? But what was much more determinative actually started not in 2012, but in 2016. Because after President Trump won in 2016, the left, not only did they start putting pressure to lower the threshold to make voting easier and, you know, potentially casting illegal ballots easier, they also went on a registration spree. They invested hundreds of millions of dollars in registering new voters. Now, I believe, and my evidence shows, that these illegal ballots were determinative in the outcome of the election. But even more determinative was the effort the left made to register hundreds of thousands of new voters. They registered over 100,000 more voters. The Democrats registered over 100,000 more voters in Georgia over the last 4 years than Republicans did. And that happened again and again and again in all of the pivotal swing states. And the problem with voter fraud is that that's sucking up so much energy and attention from us, where it was a problem, but a much smaller problem than what was much more determinative. And the third problem with it that I found is that it's incredibly demoralizing, because so many of our people now say, why should I bother voting? The voting equipment doesn't count my vote. We're going to be defrauded. Why? Now, when I first started the project to try to find voter fraud, I was hoping that the left would jump on it, or Democrats say, hey, let's see what this guy finds, because if you're a Joe Biden supporter, you certainly want him to enter a new administration free of the cloud of voter fraud, right? You want it fair and square, and if that was going to be what I found, that's what's going to be what I said, right? But they weren't interested in that, and I suspect that they actually think that the suspicion of voter fraud, whether it helps them, whether it exists or not, actually helps them, because it demoralizes our side. More of our people may say, well, I'm not going to vote because it didn't matter. And that makes it easier for them to win elections. So this is a really big problem, and we're here in Texas at the Texas Public Policy Group, and I want to make clear that the solutions have to happen here, because omnibus, forget about it. We control nothing in D.C. now. Maybe the Supreme Court, who knows? But all of the policy changes that have to address this has to happen here out in the states.
John. What kind of year did we just have? I mean, what the heck happened?
I want to jump off something that Matt said. The push to register new voters, I think after 2016, it was a manifestation of the Democrat leadership's realization that their coalition was starting to crumble, and the political coalitions writ large in this country are going through like seismic shifts. On the Republican side, certainly, and we're seeing that play out right now. But for all the talk about the Republican realignment and Trump kind of coming in and sort of taking over the GOP, I think the Democrats have, in some ways, a much larger problem on their hand. They're losing working class voters, and increasingly they're losing minority voters. And I think they understood that in 2016 after Trump won, and publicly a lot of them couldn't quite admit it, and they couldn't, didn't want to talk about it, to the press. But they had to do something to get Trump out of office, and so they have impeachment, they have the Mueller investigation, they have all these different things that didn't work out, and maybe the one that did was voter registration. If their traditional coalitions that make up the Democratic Party are shifting away from the Democrats, then they need to get more of the people who are in their coalition out to vote. And I think you saw this in 2018 with the Beto O'Rourke's campaign in Texas. You would think if someone's running statewide in Texas for a U.S. Senator seat, that they would try to run a campaign that reflects somewhat Texas and what Texas voters think and how they vote and the issues they care about. You didn't see that at all from Beto O'Rourke. You saw him run this sort of progressive, woke, I don't want to say far left, but certainly on the left wing of the Democratic side. He didn't reach out at all to try to get centrist voters or moderate Republicans or people who may have been fed up with the GOP. He just went for more.
Wait, you weren't impressed with him skateboarding in the Whataburger parking lot?
Skateboarding was impressive. No, he just went for more. He just went for more people who already agreed, and on the theory, on this theory that Democrats have been repeating now for decades, that their majority is inevitable, that it's demographic destiny, right? And that the future of Texas is blue, and we have all these young people rising up and growing Hispanic population, and they're all going to vote Democrat forever. And I think that was an outgrowth of this strategy to say, we don't need to moderate any of our positions. We don't need to tack to the center on any issues at all. Let's go out and say that we're going to confiscate AR-15s, and let's just churn out more voters that already agree with us. And I think part of the reason they're doing that is because they're in a situation where they can't really compromise with their left wing. You've seen Nancy Pelosi; she has no control over her conference. She's not running the show anymore. And so anyway, it's an interesting dynamic. Both parties are going through these huge shifts right now.
So Rachel and Matt, I'm not sure if you were following, because you have a more national focus, but Texas had the highest turnout since 1992, when you had two Texans on the ballot for president, because you had Bush and you had H. Ross Perot Jr. Mm-hmm. And the left has been saying for years, as John will attest to, that Texas isn't a red state, it's just a non-voting state, and if we could just get them out to vote, we're going to crush the Republicans. And so here we have this record turnout election, and the president gets the same percentage that he did 4 years earlier, because there was a similarly big increase in turnout for the president here in Texas. And of interest, to your point, John, there were 7 counties in the Rio Grande Valley that are majority Hispanic counties that flipped from voting for Hillary Clinton 4 years ago to voting for Trump this time around. And that's fascinating because that's not supposed to happen. That's contrary to the Democrats' playbook, isn't it?
This is one of the things I've enjoyed about the Trump presidency, and I think this particular outcome, flipping those counties, speaks to the fact that of all of the orthodoxies that Trump nuked to oblivion, one of them was this GOP consultant class idea that if you're Republican, you can't get elected unless you talk about immigration in a very specific way.
Right.
It's like, here's your index card when you meet a Hispanic person, and this is what you say, right? Literally, like we have people making money off of this. And they said for years that you can't talk about border control, that you can't talk about, what happens when people, Americans are victimized by people who weren't supposed to be here. And what that speaks to in a breakdown of law and order in this country. And Trump did that, right? But he did it in a very authentic way, and in a way I think spoke to a lot of concerns that people had, and the opposite happened, right? He actually increased with a lot of Hispanic voters, and I think it's honestly because, when we look at the Trump effect writ large, right, the conventional wisdom is he brought sort of working class voters into the Republican Party that didn't exist. Well, a lot of those Hispanic voters, they don't care about your woke identity politics. They care about bread and butter issues, right? We tend to talk to certain genders or races in a very homogenous way, like they're all the same, and they care about what white liberals care about. No, they care about providing for their kids. They want their kids to go to good schools. They want to get their have good jobs, and they don't want they want a crack at a good corporate job that's not going to be undercut by H-1Bs coming in from mega corporations.
I mean, they haven't embraced the term Latinx down in Laredo. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, we could call this the Latinx effect, right? Because I think that there's a Pew poll that shows
They haven't even heard of it.
Yeah, they haven't even heard of it. 3% of Hispanic Americans identify themselves as Latinx. It's only white liberals that call
And
themselves
those were the ones that, by the way, graduated from the UC system out in California.
Right.
So, yeah. Matt, what do you think about this demographic? Is this something, you pioneered some of this stuff with identifying low propensity kind of working class people who had an affinity for Trump 4 years ago.
Yeah,
So you were kind of at the front end of what appears to be a realignment in American politics.
Yeah, and I would clarify slightly. It's not necessarily working class. Many of the journalists, probably the biggest concentration of midwits in our society, thought that Trump's appeal was basically just solely, this blue-collar working class. But the reality is that when because I did the very first poll that the Trump campaign ever did, and I did it in some early states, and we did some regression analysis. We had some very good psychographic mapping, which means we can kind of predict what somebody's going to do a little bit before they do it, based on other qualifications or other characteristics. All of this was built on data from Obama's former team, which they didn't know we were using at the time, which is, they had the best stuff, so we had to use it, right, to help us win. But I think that ideologically, not to get too into the weeds here, but what our real people are, the people who most embrace our message, you can call it America First message, you can call it, Reagan Democrat message. Pat Buchanan used to refer to these people as peasants with pitchforks. They don't really know a single demographic group or necessarily even a certain socioeconomic group. Because if you look at Trump's, at least among the Republicans, those who support them, there's a slight, the curve on the income scale is pretty much like the rest of the Republican Party. It might have a little bit of a curve on the lower end, but also flares up a lot higher on the top end. That's where you find all the entrepreneurs who look in the mirror and see Trump in themselves. But fundamentally, on an ideological level, what these people are anti-postmodernists. So postmodernism, and if philosophy lefties get angry at my simplification of their, something they spent 10 years in school studying. But postmodernism is essentially the idea that if it feels good, do it, and by extension, if it feels good, it must be right. Anti-postmodernism is the rejection of it. These are people who are rich in the wisdom of the Old Testament, and this is a common trait among many immigrants to this country who came here legally, became citizens, embraced the flag, and vote. And they actually, I think, are a much more ready demographic for a lot of Trump's messaging because they don't want what they escaped from following them here. They know better than anyone else what they came away from and what brought them here. And they are, here's a simple difference. Okay, we're going to get a little religious if you can spare me a moment. We all know people who might be of our own religion, right? Who do you find to be more faithful to that religion? The people who were born into it, like cradle Catholics, or the people who became an adult and then they decide, I'm going to convert to that church, regardless of what church it is? It's always that latter group that's a lot more passionate about that. And I find that that is a demographic to be mined with Trump language, not the GOP consultant language, which says, oh no, we need to have a pathway to citizenship, or all this soft stuff that they've been peddling for a generation has been, shoved down our throats by the likes of people like Paul Ryan, until finally we had somebody show up that did embrace that language, and they actually won.
So, yes, good. So John, a week ago, something happened that obviously could be at least called a political earthquake, right? But it followed on an entire summer of discontent where you had largely speaking, the Democrats either encouraging, bailing out people in these violent riots, these destructive riots around the country. And now, because of a media that has largely abandoned its neutral pretense and is seen as nakedly partisan, you have individuals out there who don't know what to trust insofar as where they get their information from. And as a result, you see, I think, a fairly significant proliferation of these conspiracy groupings, that people who believe that, for example, there was some firefight in Germany between special forces and the CIA, this battle over a server where they were shifting votes from Trump to Biden. And it's like, really? And everybody was killed? Nobody's talked since then? I mean, really? That's like a thing. So the violence that happened at the Capitol last week, I know that we generally, in a time of election, we're always, there's these heightened emotions and everything's either really good or really bad, depending on whether your side won or lost. But how important do you think last week was, and how likely do you think that it will be superseded by poor governance and policy errors and new wars that we might get into?
Democratic overreach? Yeah, it already has been superseded. I mean, they're impeaching the president right now. The idea that Trump incited those people is a lie, and the people who are peddling it in the corporate media, I don't like to say mainstream media, I like to say corporate media, they know it. The people who were there know it, and professional plug, the reason I know is because I talked to a bunch of them, and I have a piece coming out at the Federalist tomorrow with some of these interviews in them. And the reason I talked to these people, some of them gave me my name, gave their names, and some of them wanted to be quoted anonymously because they're facing threats of firing and harassment. I knew that the corporate media wouldn't talk to them because the corporate media is not interested in understanding why they were there. I'm not talking about the people who grappled with police and forced their way and smashed the building. There was hundreds of thousands of people there last Wednesday. The vast majority of them didn't find out what was happening until they got back to their hotels that night, because there was no cell service on the Capitol grounds because there were so many people there. But we have a situation where the corporate media and big tech went out of their way and bent over backwards all spring and summer to contextualize and explain and sympathize with the riots and the violence that of a kind that we have not seen in a generation, and to the point where they didn't want to just understand the Black Lives Matter and Antifa rioters. They wanted you to sympathize with them, and if you didn't, well, what's wrong with you? Are you a racist or something? And this was the message we got from every major media outlet and every cable news network in America for 9 months. And something like Wednesday happens, similar situation, very large group of protesters that have what they believe is a valid complaint. They want to peacefully express their discontent. A small group of people have another plan. to sow mayhem and cause violence and to assault police officers. Literally the same thing that's happened in dozens of U.S. cities, and in some U.S. cities for months and months, like in Portland. And the corporate media has no interest in understanding why those people were there and telling their stories and lending a sympathetic ear, forget lend a sympathetic ear, just talking to those people. You don't talk to traitors and terrorists, right? All you need to know about them is where they live and who they work for. That's the attitude, not of left-wing radicals on Twitter. That's the attitude of major media corporations and powerful people in them. That's the attitude of our entire elite class toward 75 million people, basically. You can't have a country like that. And I don't have any answers for it, but I do know that those people are not going away, and so we're going to have to deal with that. And if we want to figure out how to save the country, we're going to have to deal with it soon.
So you've worked on Capitol Hill, and I guess you're still kind of hanging around that area, aren't you, Rachel?
I never left, really.
You never left.
I'm a hanger-oner.
You're kind of a swamp creature in a way.
Okay, let's just back up now.
So
let's not say things we can't take back.
So the point though is that you have a lot of friends, both elected officials and staffers, and probably people who've gone on to other parts of that political ecosystem. What was your impression? Because were you out there when this happened? Were you in D.C.?
I was in D.C. Our office at Conservative Partnership has been open on Capitol Hill since June, so we were all at work very close to the Capitol and the House office buildings, and left in the afternoon because the police perimeter kept getting pushed back and back. So, but yeah, we were obviously hearing from our friends who were at the protest and also our friends who were in the building, when everything was kind of locked down. And I think something John said is very important, because whatever drove, you have two separate groups of people, right? You have the people that sort of breached the Capitol and sort of initiated the mayhem there, but you had thousands of people that spent their own money to come to Washington because they felt disenfranchised, because they felt that their views weren't being heard. And you have to ask yourself, what is it that drives those people there? And that sentiment, right, is not going away when Donald Trump goes away. And this is something that I think the institutional Republican Party has not acknowledged, either intentionally or because they're so detached at this point, I think, from the larger base. But you have a group of people who really thinks this is about Trump. And it's not about the fact that Trump, I think, still has something like 73% approval among Republicans, right? There are people that still feel very attached to him and what he stood for. And when you have a moment where people don't feel that they don't see themselves in their politics, right? Because politics, right, is where we work out these differences. Politics exists so we can solve our problems together, right? We deliberate, we debate, we vote on really consequential questions. And the fact that our Republicans institutionally couldn't get there, right? The fact that by the end of this, legislators were really given a binary choice that no legislator should ever have to make the choice between objecting to an election or basically, blowing off what is the biggest issue to their voters. They should never have to make that choice. And the fact that they ended up there is one of the biggest failures of political leadership I've ever seen in my life, to be quite frank. And I've now spent 15 years in DC. The thing under 35 has expired. So I've seen some things. But, we could have addressed this problem. Republicans in Washington just didn't take the base seriously. Think about it. If they had actually addressed this problem, what would that have looked like? Right? It would have said, hey, there is something wrong. There is, even if it's not voter fraud, right? Even if you want to give people the benefit of the doubt, there's probably a lot of irregularities in an election that's done by mail in this huge country that we've never done before. Let's take that seriously. Let's have some hearings. Let's leverage, I know you say this might not have ever happened, but the fight would have been good, to leverage the omnibus to say, hey, states, you want this money? We're not giving it to you until you initiate some voter reform. And then I would have said, hey, voters, if you give us the Senate, if you keep the majority in the Senate, this will be our #1 issue when we come back. That would have been the political leadership that I think would have maybe calmed the waters, given some catharsis to these voters who really felt they weren't being heard. But instead, we got dismissal, and we got people blowing off these concerns. And so what we got was a group of really angry people, and they're still angry. And how Republicans deal with that going forward is going to tell us a lot about what this post-Trump GOP will look like.
Well, just to clarify, I didn't try to throw cold water on the omnibus idea at all. What I meant is that now there is no omnibus, there is no leverage in Washington, D.C.
And there was
because
lack of will then
we don't.
anyway.
And I don't disagree. I think, and not just that, but also the defense bill. If you want leverage, that's where you have to get it. And the thing, we watched for 4 years, love him or hate him, Trump was a fighter. He fought. And he fought, the thing that got him in so much trouble was he fought as hard as the left fights for their side. Everybody else in leadership of his party and that movement, that they would rather you not think them impolite. They don't want you to think of them as brutish or boorish. So that was always what prevented him from fight. In this country, sad to say it, but it's a street fight now, and Trump was a street fighter. And unfortunately, he was in that arena alone against an entire, basically, remember, the incoming Biden administration, they were bailing out the people burning the cities down with their campaign funds. Think about that. I mean, what would you think would happen now if President Trump used his campaign funds to bail out people who were, maybe they didn't do anything violent, they just walked into the Capitol because the doors were open, they wanted to see what was on the inside. You have any idea what would happen to him? Do you have any idea what the reaction would be among people like Liz Cheney would be if he dared to do something? There was clearly some criminal behavior. It clearly needs to be prosecuted what happened to the Capitol. But could you imagine if he did something like that and what the reaction would be? Not from the media, of course they'd blow up, but from our own people. Did you ever hear a Democrat criticize Joe Biden's campaign for bailing out looters and people who assaulted police officers and caused mayhem? No, not at all. Not at all. So just on the protests of the Capitol in general, though, I am actually fairly anti-protest in general because I believe that protest energy needs to be focused on things that are more productive, like voter registration and turnout. And I get it. And that's the problem, again, with this voter fraud thing is because we are all used to the Postal Service losing packages. We're all used to problems if you have Medicare or Medicaid, your grandmother having trouble getting things paid, or if you're the VA, something not going right, or a pothole not being filled right. Those are all problems we're kind of used to, and we kind of, to some extent, accept it, as she was saying, because we have this mechanism, the elections, to fix all the things that are wrong. But then when we have the sense that the elections are not being run right, well, what do we do to fix that? We don't have anything. And sometimes, potentially, that anger turns into basically demoralization, or it turns into something much, much worse. And that's been the case in many other countries around the world. So again, I come back to, we've got to look at the states where we can have influence, where we can leverage what powers we have and take advantage of that. And I think Texas is a great place to start.
Well, it's time for your questions. And so what I would like to do is set out a few brief ground rules. Number one, we have a microphone that will rapidly come to your table as I pick them out. Number two, tell us your name and if you have an affiliation that you care to share. And number three, and this is the most important one, questions end in a question mark, and they're generally not speeches. Okay? So with that admonition and direction, let's start with the questions, and we'll go right here in the middle of the room because it's close to the guy with the mic. Very good. You get the inaugural question.
I'm Jeff McManus, and I'm affiliated with the Republican Party of Bexar County. My question to the panel is, you did not discuss the influence of the Chinese in relationship to this last election and their involvement with the release of the virus. Would you please comment on that? Question mark.
That's great. Well, excellent. Thank you for that. I'll kick that off, and then maybe some of our other panelists would like to mention that as well. So first of all, I think there's increasing consensus that the virus, the COVID-19, was likely something that had been developed in that high-end lab in Wuhan. The question is, was it purposefully released or accidentally released? I know that there was an interesting photo that's since been scrubbed from the internet of one of the freezers that was being used to contain the viruses, and the seals were completely frozen over, such that the seals were no longer functional because the Chinese weren't taking care of their equipment that in this French-designed lab. And then, of course, once it got out, you saw Chinese doctors hushed up and persecuted, on rumor-mongering charges. One of the early doctors, of course, famously died in hospital from COVID as he was trying to warn local authorities. And then you had the final specter of China doing this very draconian lockdown internally, while simultaneously telling the World Health Organization and the rest of the world that everything was fine and let's continue to have international flights in and out of China. And so it would seem by the policy, right, that they were trying to minimize or slow the spread internally while maximizing it externally. That's at least what the effect was. It's hard to tell with these closed governments, just how much of this is thought through malfeasance and how much of this is incompetence and local officials covering for themselves and trying not to invoke the ire of Beijing. But yes, I mean, we had the best economy in recent history, all kinds of people working who had difficulty being hired in the past, some due to the economy, some due to Trump's border policies that clamped down a bit on illegal immigration. And then in a month, it was gone, right? And we're still dealing with the aftermath. Does anyone want to take on the question of the People's Republic of China?
There was a great piece in New York Magazine, of all places, I think last week, the week before, like a 12,000-word essay about this, about the theory that it came from a lab and that it was scientists were messing around with a coronavirus and trying to add features to it to make it attached to human lung tissue, and that further analysis of the COVID-19 is making it clear that this is probably not a naturally occurring thing. And it was a great article, and it went into a lot of detail and made a pretty compelling case that it did come from a lab. It didn't weigh in on whether or not this was intentionally released, but just focus more on the science of the virus itself. But it was funny because, Senator Tom Cotton said something similar at the beginning of last year when this was first coming out, and he was sort of dismissed as a conspiracy theorist and a kook by Democrats in the corporate press. I think China did have a big role to play. We also had a big role to play in creating these kinds of labs overseas and then funding them. I don't know who thought that would be a great idea, that we could control that. So we need that's something we're going to need to reckon with in the future. But I think the fact that Tom Cotton said that early on in the pandemic, and it's not until some writer for New York Magazine publishes an essay about it 9 months later that anyone will take seriously, is a testament to our vulnerability to something like this, and our impotence in the face of a regime like Communist China. We have a lot of strengths as a country, as a democracy, but right now, this is not one of them. Our inability to have actual debates and have a public square in this country makes it impossible for us to rise to the challenges that we're facing now, that we faced over the past year, and that are coming up very soon. And I wanted to say something too to Matt's point earlier about people losing confidence in elections. People giving up on politics is the worst thing that can happen for this country. It is the worst thing that can happen. And it's been happening for a while, gradually. And I want to say this here because we're in Texas and we're in Austin, and just down the street in 2013, a insurrectionist mob took over the Texas Senate and shut down debate and ran the clock out on the session because the Texas Senate was considering an abortion bill. Maybe some of you were there for that. It was ugly. It was violent. It should have been a wake-up call that this whole group of people, they happen to be Democrats and progressives, had given up on the legislative process in Texas and were going to, by force, shut the Texas Senate down. And I think you can draw a line from the storming of the Texas Senate to the storming of the Texas Capitol of people left and right gradually giving up on politics. And when you give up on politics, you resort to street violence and conspiracy theories of the kind you were talking about, Chuck.
Yeah. Down front. And I don't see any hands yet on either. Okay, okay, we'll get to you over here next. So, yes, thank you.
First, a kidding comment. I lived around Chicago for 60 years. I can tell you a lot about vote fraud if you'd like to learn some of the specifics. But the second one, to your point, you're missing a point. In Chicago, they don't have to vote. They vote anyway. But my actual question now, coming back to it, I am Roger Keats. I'm just an old duffer. And so in Washington, we talk about all these mistakes they made. Have any of those spineless eunuchs taken responsibility and decided they'd do something about it? Or are they going to continue to do what we have been doing for years, which is do nothing and learn nothing?
Well, I concur. This is the challenge for the Republican Party because they were going to be forced to reckon with themselves post-Trump anyway. But the problem that we have, I think, is that every opportunist in Congress, which is to say all of them, are now using what happened at the Capitol as reason to marginalize any concern, or as a cover for their own bad behavior, right? I actually think, like I just sort of laid out, I actually think what happened at the Capitol lies more at the feet of the Republican intellectual class in DC's inability to deal with their own voters than it does have anything to do with Trump. Right, no, exactly. And I think that the worst thing Trump did from their perspective was force them to communicate with their own base, because as you point out, the Republican Party for 20, 30 years has had contempt for its own base. And, I think they were going to be forced to deal with that, but now they're all hiding from that because they can, right? Because, Mitch McConnell can say, well, I can purge Trump and everything he stands for from this party. I can, come back to whatever the uniparty stands for in DC, and work with, Chuck Schumer to incorporate, the two things I've ever seen move Mitch McConnell on are war and campaign finance. So I assume those will be the two big priorities going forward.
Just pretend it never happened.
Right, exactly. They want to whitewash the whole thing and pretend it never happened. So this is something that I think we as a movement need to decide how we take that message to DC, what we are going to expect of our elected officials. Because, for years they've said, just give us one more Supreme Court seat, just give us one more majority, just give us, one more House, and we'll get it done. And they haven't. So how is it that we now respond, I think, is what we need to figure out.
Well, I just would expand on that a little bit and say that, and I hear this a lot, it's like, when are they going to do the right thing? When are they going to start listening and take the right steps? When are they going to embrace the new voters and the new energy that Trump has brought into the party? And that's the wrong question to ask, because you don't control they. They don't care about you. There's only us. And what are we going to do? What are you going to do? And same thing with the question about the Chinese virus. I mean, let's say it did come from lab. Let's say they released it intentionally. What are you going to do about it, right? That's a start, but you got to get your family. You got to get your town, your neighborhood. It can't just be you. Because I've had a debate on Twitter today. I really stepped in it. Somebody said, hey, I'm going to quit the GOP. I'm fed up with them. Well, who do you think the GOP is? The GOP is whoever shows up. It's always been, and that's what the Democrat Party is too. It's whoever shows up. So if you decide you're going to withdraw from that, do you think you're going to like even more what the GOP party becomes? It's not like it's a McDonald's where you decide you're going to boycott them because they messed your coffee order up. It's not this entity over here. It's who shows up, who takes ownership of it. The best example I can think of is that, look, who was demoralized and frustrated with the Republican Party? Christians. Yes. In the late 70s and 80s. They finally said, what we're going to do? We're going to run one of our own and try to do something about it. Pat Roberts ran in 88, lost. Did they quit? No. They organized. They became something called the Christian Coalition. And for a generation, they ran the Republican Party. It didn't start that way. It started with the county organizations, the state parties, and then the national organization, to the point that you could not become the Republican nominee without being completely committed to pro-life, at least, and a couple of other issues that were very important to them. And now, it took a while, but I don't know that Roe versus Wade or Planned Parenthood versus Casey is really all that safe at the Supreme Court anymore. I'm not certain, but I don't know. And that is a consequence of their actions. We look at what the Democrats have achieved now. It seems like they've won it all. What they've been doing, what got them to here, started 100 years ago. For them, this has been a long game. They've suffered through losses and defeats, but they kept coming right back. And now we have the most left-wing, socialist / communist / I would say anti-American government in history. But this operation for them started decades ago. So we need to have patience with ourselves, but we also have to be willing to ourselves say, what can I do? Did I go to my precinct meeting for the Republican Party this year? Did I bring my neighbors? You've got to encourage more people to do that. If you haven't done that, you've got to start doing it. My part, I've started to look ahead America to register and turn out disaffected patriotic voters. 4 years ago, I started raising the issues that, look, the left is out registering us, and I started pitching it to big dollar donors. I couldn't get any of their attention. They were interested in giving millions of dollars to super PACs that would blow it all in 5 minutes on Super Bowl ads. They were investing in votes. I was asking them to invest in voters, which is a much more substantial return. But now I think the party's woken up, and I think I will be successful in this endeavor. Maybe you're going to be part of it, or maybe you're part of your own endeavor here. But it's being upset about what they're doing. It's a losing game. You're never going to get anywhere with that. You've got to look internally at your house, yourself, your household, your family, your neighborhood, and put yourself out there. You become the change. You be the hope.
We have a question in the front row over here.
Hi, Don Dyer. I clean the toilets at the TPPF headquarter building, so that's my association. Okay, in the earlier session, we got a fire hose worth of comments and data about voter fraud. We talk about voter fraud. We say there's voter fraud, but the Democrats have always committed voter fraud. In each of your estimations, did voter fraud determine the winner of this presidential election?
Very crisp question. Did voter fraud determine the winner of this election? John?
I don't know.
I believe that the number of illegal ballots makes it impossible for us to know who is the deserved winner of this election. And I have the evidence, I have the names, I can share them with you.
I think Matt's probably the only qualified person to answer this question. But I would say, were there mistakes and irregularities? Absolutely. Does it rise to the level of fraud? Probably.
I know I did a lot of reporting right after the election, frantically, for about 2 weeks, mostly talking to people who had seen, not seen voter fraud, but seen election laws being broken in places like Detroit and Philadelphia, and also reporting on these massive illegal cash for vote schemes in places like Nevada and Arizona on tribal lands, where they would hold like a raffle and give away cash cards and electronics, and in exchange, in order to enter the raffle, you had to prove that you voted, which is illegal, and which was funded by the by some groups that get taxpayer funding. So, was there massive voter fraud on a level that we haven't seen in presidential elections? Absolutely, I know that for a fact because of the people I've talked to. But I can't say. I don't know that. I mean, that's the problem with voter fraud, right? When it's done, it's done. And I think that's something that a lot of these judges hid behind in these lawsuits. They're saying, well, you're asking me to throw out, 20,000 ballots because they're tainted, and it's not that all 20,000 are fraudulent, but I would rather take the tainted ballots than disenfranchise people, right? There's nothing worse than disenfranchising people. But, so it makes it so it's impossible to prove it. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
Here's the problem. Okay, I think all the lawsuits are done, at least regarding this. So I'm a little bit freer to talk than I was when I was an expert witness in ongoing trials. But the campaign made some major mistakes. The first is that it's much easier to challenge an illegal ballot before Election Day than it is after. and they made no challenges of clearly illegal ballots, of people who were not residents of the state. And that was the primary source, I think, of illegal ballots, was somebody who did not live in Georgia, didn't think their vote really counted in New York. They wanted to make a difference, even though they've lived in New York City for the last 10 years. They had an old address, they got a hold of a ballot and sent it. Now that happens every election to some extent, but it happened especially in this election because of the intensity and because the margins were so close. In any state, I believe any state in this country, if the election is reasonably close like it was in Georgia, you probably would have to walk away from that election not knowing for certain who was the deserved winner, because there's so much of this so many instances of people voting where they don't truly have residency and the state not cracking down on it. Now, if you think about it a minute, we're all fans of the Electoral College in this room, aren't we? Well, what happens to the Electoral College if you can vote wherever you want to vote? See, right now the left, I don't think, has the juice to make the changes legally to get rid of the Electoral College. But if they just simply let people vote in the states wherever they want to, that is bypassing the Electoral College. And it's also bypassing the Great Compromise, which says that every state gets 2 senators and the House of Representatives is based on population, right? But if you can vote in whatever state Senate race you want to, well, you're also neutralizing that. So I think that's fundamentally the issue. And that's, the voter fraud of like these like inner city stories about these machines casting ballots in people's names without their knowledge. We have evidence that occurred, but what we found so much more of is people who did not meet residency requirements, who the state did a poor job of hygiene, decided to just pick and choose, got to pick and choose where they wanted to vote, where they think it has the most impact, regardless of where they lived, bypassing the Electoral College. And I believe, and I've had the evidence, that was determinative in this election.
So one of the big warning signs that was beginning to happen as COVID was manifesting is you saw a series of coordinated lawsuits, an enormous amount of money that was spent, in many cases on sue and settle, where these groups would approach, former AG Holder was part of one of these groups, where they would approach a city or a state and say that because of COVID, it was discriminatory, the rules about in-person voting, and that you had to dramatically expand by mail voting. And then the other inevitable shoe to drop was because in the case of Pennsylvania, you're going from a state that all the voting happened on election day by law, they don't have early voting there, and a limited number of by mail votes. So 4 years ago it was about 250,000. And then it gets expanded tenfold, and so when you expand it tenfold, the other shoe to drop is, well, you can't possibly do all the signature validation needed because we have too many votes. We can't process them quickly enough, so we have to drop the standards down so that if it's just an X, that's okay. And you saw that in Nevada, you saw that in Pennsylvania, saw that in other states. And so, technically you'd look at that and say, well, is that fraud? Well, they didn't follow state election law, and in many cases, the elected authorities were in on it, right? In other words, they wanted to do it. The other aspect that we talked about in our last panel was that there was close to $500 million spent by private foundations to augment the vote, to supercharge the vote in certain core urban areas. You saw this hugely in Philadelphia, where the election budget for the city of Philadelphia was more than doubled with private money, about $10 million, that added all these drop boxes, paid ads to encourage people to go out and vote, paying city officials, city bureaucrats to go door to door and collect ballots, right, to supercharge the turnout in Philadelphia. And you didn't see similar monies dropped, of course, in the areas of Pennsylvania that favored Trump. And so all of this was seen coming a whole year out, or 9 months out. So it's not like it should have been a shock. And unfortunately, very little was done. Here in Texas, we fought it. Our Attorney General in Texas, Ken Paxton, won a series of very pivotal lawsuits that the foundation, through our general counsel, Rob Henneke, participated in helping with some of amicus and amicus briefs and things like that. So this was like a huge deal and was fought out all over the country. And they were almost successful here in Texas in making it happen. We have time for one more succinct question. So let's go to the other side of the room, way in the back, looks like. Yes? Thank you.
So what we got here is a perfect storm that you've been describing, and it's been going on for a long time, right? And so I'm a precinct chair in Travis County. And in my precinct, it's mostly Democrat. But if the truth be known, they are conservatives and don't know it. And that's the honest to God truth, okay? What I need, and that's the question, and Matt's kind of sparked me on this, is material that can help me in my community convince people that it's not about personalities, it's about principles. How can we get these people to understand their principles are the same as my principles?
Well, 30 seconds. You want to take that on, Matt?
If I was in your shoes, look, I'll give you a simple example. Is I started a Republican club when I was in high school. And I started every week throwing an event in a classroom, right? For about 8 meetings in a row, nobody showed up. But then some pretty girls were sitting at a table across from me at lunch one day and saying, we need to get some extracurriculars on our resume or on our for college. And I said, hey, I know something you can do. And then they came, and then a few weeks later, the room was full. From your point of view, look, it's simple. This is what I would do if I was in your shoes, because I've been in your shoes. Get a room, get an event, get a local band to come and play, bring them in, and have some speaker come in and talk. And sort of meet them halfway. Find issues that they already agree with you on. The best one, I think, actually, that we completely ignored this last election is fair play for women. Because you take every feminist who's upset about her daughter losing opportunities to a creepy guy in a dress, the left side owns that. They can't get away from that. And you do it just like the Grand Canyon was built, okay? The Grand Canyon wasn't the Grand Canyon when it started. It was a little puddle, a little hole, and a little water got in there, and it froze. And when water freezes, it's the most powerful force on earth. It expands and grows the crack. Then more water comes in, freeze, expand the crack. You find that first little crack, and maybe it's that issue, maybe it's something more local, and you just build it and grow it and grow it and grow it. And so really, the future of this party, in your part of the state, there's no they, and you realize it's you because you stepped forward to be that captain. And I applaud you. My heart goes out to you. That's all. Can we get a round of applause for this man? Because our family, our state, our country depends on people just like you. And I'm glad. I'd love to talk to you later, but I think you see where I'm coming from. You just got to get out there, get the events going, get people, get their ears, and start leveraging that and start building that Grand Canyon from a tiny little crack.
Also, start with events because millennials don't read.
Yeah.
Start with events because millennials don't read.
Unless there's an app, they're not reading it.
That's nice. Okay, well, that's a really encouraging thing for someone who works for a think tank to hear, right? It's like, well, that's why we have a film department, right? So that's why we have these great filmmakers at TPPF. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for attending this session. One last word. It is so easy to get discouraged, and I hope that you heard a bit of encouragement, but what you also heard, if you listen carefully, was this stuff isn't easy. It takes a lot of hard work. And we know that the other side, who perhaps more fervently believes in a robust, all-powerful government, they put a lot of effort into it because for them, government is really important. They have all these grand plans that they'd like to do with government. And for many of us, we just like to be left alone. And so that's part of the challenge. But you got to get out there and you got to work hard. None of these things are going to come and just land on your lap. That's what it requires. And so again, please applaud our panel. John, Matt, Rachel, thank you so much for coming. And I guess we have a wonderful dinner tonight. So let's look forward to that. Thank you.